Hello, Jennifer. Thank you so much for joining me on The Same Drugs. I'm really excited to meet you.
I'm excited to meet you too. Welcome back to Twitter. I've been
Oh,
anxiously awaiting your return.
I had really almost given up, and it's just been the greatest week.
It's awesome.
I'm
There's
really
hope.
enjoying myself. Yeah. Twitter is fun again.
That's great.
Um, and I suppose Twitter was one of the things that sort of got you into hot water, but
Not the
I
only,
don't.
but one. Yeah.
Yeah.
Not the only thing.
Expressing opinions that go against the approved narrative, of course. Um, I wonder, before we get into all of that, the politics, the controversy, what happened at Levi's, I wonder if you can just tell me a bit about yourself.
Sure.
Where you came from, where you started, how you
Yeah.
got here.
Yeah. Let's see. I am from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. That's where I grew up, Philadelphia and sort of Jersey area. I had a very weird childhood, an unusual childhood. I was an elite gymnast, which I don't recommend. It's a sport that is rife with abuse and cruelty. And I was very successful. I was the 1986 national champion and a 7-time national team member, but was, I would say physically and emotionally brutalized in the sport. It's a tough sport, and I suffered from that abusive culture when I came out of it. That said, I was a pretty functional human, regardless of the abuse that I suffered in the sport. I went to Stanford. I moved to San Francisco. I started working at Levi's in 1999. It was not my first job, but it was like, early in my career. I think I was only 29 when I started there. And let's see, I have 4 kids. They have a very wide age range. I've got a 22-year-old, a 19-year-old, 8 and 6. Um, I spent close to 23 years at Levi's. I worked my way up from the very bottom rungs of the ladder. It was tough, and the book, which we'll talk about a little, is as much about being a woman in corporate America as it is about, a lot of the COVID madness of the last 2 years. But I loved the company, I loved the product, and I stayed and ended up as the chief marketing officer. I think in 2013, did that job for 8 years, was successful in that job. And ultimately, even during all my outspokenness on COVID and restrictions to kids from COVID, I got promoted to brand president in 2020. And our business was in great shape, in large part because of the work that I'd done. But ultimately, I was outspoken around opening public schools in San Francisco and across the country during COVID, and that was unacceptable. And after 2 years of conflict at the company, I was told there wasn't a place for me anymore. I should say that one other thing that's just an about me fact, the gymnastics stuff. So in 2008, I wrote my first book, actually, which was about the culture in gymnastics. And it was my warm up, I would say, to cancel culture. I had no idea at the time. It was sort of early days of social media. I wasn't very well versed in the ways of social media. I don't even know if we called it cancel culture in 2008. Probably someone did, but I didn't know about it. So I wrote a first person account. It was the first kind of first-hand account of what the sport was really like. And I was just brutalized. I mean, it was a smaller stage and smaller community than what I've been dealing with of late. It was sort of the gymnastics community and then the broader kind of Olympic movement. But I was called every name you can think of. I was a grifter and a liar, and I was going to be sued, and I was going to whatever. I was a horrible person who was destroying the reputations of these very respectable men, these coaches who were sexual abusers and emotional and physical abusers. And 10 years later, I was redeemed because Dr. Larry Nassar, who was the doctor for Team USA Gymnastics, went to prison for life for sexually assaulting hundreds of young athletes. So all of a sudden, then everybody said, oh, I guess, not I guess she was right. They said she was right and we always supported her, which is a lie. But so I had like a year and a half of redemption before I decided I didn't like being liked or something. And I decided to speak out on the school closures in March of 2020. And that would end up being the end of my time at Levi's and possibly the end of any sort of corporate career. We'll see.
Yeah, I did want to talk to you about the gymnastics stuff. I've always had the impression that gymnastics was a pretty horrible competitive sport, especially for girls. I mean, it's mostly girls who are in gymnastics, of course, but like just in terms of the body shaming, and the super intense pressure put on these girls. And then, of course, more recently, we've found
So,
out about all these abuse allegations. What was your
yeah.
experience like in gymnastics?
Yeah, I mean, I came up in the 80s. I started in the 70s, so I go way back. The emotional and physical abuse is widespread. I mean, it's rampant. It's the accepted coaching methodology. And I'll give you a few examples of what I mean by emotional and physical abuse. Um, we were fat shamed repeatedly. I was weighed in 2, sometimes 3 times a day. Your weight was announced on a loudspeaker in the gym. If you gained a quarter of a pound, you were forced to do, an hour extra, 2 hours extra conditioning. It was said over loudspeakers, I don't coach fat gymnasts. You're disgusting. You're a lazy piece of garbage. So that was sort of just the fat shaming part. And we were literally denied food. I mean, if you traveled with the coach, you weren't allowed to order meals. You weren't allowed. I mean, we were kept to I was eating about maybe 400 calories a day for several years as a teenager when I was training 8 hours a day sometimes, and constantly fat shamed. I weighed 98 pounds and had like 2% body fat. But fat shaming is a huge part of it. We were forced to train on very serious injuries. I trained on a broken ankle for 2 years, which, isn't great now, as you might imagine. I didn't understand at the time. I thought it just hurts. Well, first of all, the doctors who were in cahoots with my coaches kept telling me there was nothing wrong, and they gave me cortisone shots every 6 weeks. I took 10 Advil, maybe a day, before
Wow.
practice, just so that I could walk into the gym.
And you're still a
Um,
kid at this point, a kid
oh,
with
yeah, I was
zero body fat.
15. Yeah, I was 15, 16 years old. I mean, the bullying and name calling, and it's hard to really describe. And of course, I was called a liar for saying all of this, but now everybody accepts and knows that it's true. Um, it's horrible. And my belief is that sort of emotional and physical abuse, it it turns you kind of upside down. Like, you don't, the way a therapist explained it to me later in life is when a parent beats a child, they say to the child, I wouldn't have to do this if you weren't bad. It's your fault. So you think everything is your fault. So then you internalize all this shame, and you're weak and lazy and bad. And none of this treatment you wouldn't have to endure any of this treatment if you were just good, if you were better. So
Mhm.
it becomes this like endless shame spiral. And it also, I think, leads to a child being vulnerable to sexual abuse, because you have all of the, right? Because you already are upside down in the world. You think everything is your fault. You think you're a bad person. So if this coach who, is prone to taking advantage of children is doing this terrible thing and sexually abusing an athlete, or in the case of Larry Nassar, the doctor, where he says it's medical treatment, this child in the office doesn't know any different. She's already
Mm.
been told that she needs to keep her mouth shut about everything. She's already completely disoriented in the world. So, I always felt that there was a higher percentage of sexual abuse in the gymnastics world, in the gymnastics community, than in the world at large. 2 out of 10 staff members in my club were known sexual abusers who ultimately ended up in prison, not for life, but for a short period. The national team coach in the 1980s was a serial rapist. But you weren't allowed to say it. He was a respected coach. He was the coach of the 1984 Olympic team. And, we all knew it. We all whispered about it, but you couldn't say it. It was just there. You didn't matter. He mattered. His reputation mattered. He's now banned from the sport. He's never suffered any legal, criminal charges due to statutes of limitations on
Mm.
these kinds of things. But the sport is it's just rife with it, but you weren't allowed to say it. The sport was very invested in presenting this image of these cute little happy pixies dancing around. That's how they generated, advertising revenue and ad dollars and all that stuff. And children were sacrificed for the image of the sport, which meant money for
right.
the men.
And yeah, and I mean, already kids are taught to obey adults and respect authority. And, they are just learning about boundaries, and some aren't learning about boundaries. And then on top of all that, I'm presuming that in gymnastics, that's way more intense, that you obey your coach, like listen to these, don't question, right?
That's right. Yeah. I mean, it's one of the points that I have been making is that I grew up in such an oppressive environment that was just obedience was demanded of you. And if I can overcome that and I can kind of break through that, then I know that other people can. If I can sort of call a lie and stand up and say, this is untrue and it's harming children, or this is untrue and it's harming, then you all have to be able to do it. Stop being so afraid. If I can screw up my courage to do it, because I was definitely raised in a culture where silence was mandatory.
Yeah, I think so too. I'm not super sympathetic to the people who claim that they can't speak up because they'll be ostracized, they'll get in trouble with their friends, it'll be uncomfortable for them at work, maybe they'll get fired. And it's not because I don't think getting fired is a big deal. It's a really big deal. I mean, people need to pay their rent and take care of their families and put food on the table. But I also know how much so many people have suffered and risked to speak up and tell the truth and say, this is wrong and this is harmful. And the way to, to succeed in those arenas in terms of pushing back and in terms of getting the truth out there, in terms of forcing at least a rational, honest conversation or debate, is if more and more people do it. And so I get frustrated. I don't know how you feel about that when people are like, oh, I can't, sorry, like, you're right privately, but like publicly, sorry, I don't want to be associated with you.
Yeah, I know. I've been ranting about this lately to my husband, because since my book came out and just since I've been kind of speaking out about all of this in terms of the COVID restrictions, I get so many, as I'm sure you do, DMs and emails from people saying, I totally support you, but I can't like your comments and I can't say that I read your book. I can't even say that I read it because people won't like me, or I might, whatever. It's like people are so unwilling to stand apart from the group. It's like they live in fear. They live in mortal fear of standing apart from the group. And I used to have more sympathy for it. I have very little now. I am with you. Because the fact is if you did it and others did it, we wouldn't be a minority.
Yeah, exactly. Well, we're not a minority. We're not a minority. This, this woke mentality, this woke politic, it's such a cliched term. I just haven't, this is the term that we use. So for whatever, it's not representative of the majority of people at all. And I'm sure you know that better than most, in terms of, for me, I've been asked by interviewers or journalists, how does it feel to be hated by everyone? And I'm like, I'm not hated by everyone. I don't feel hated at all, because 95% of the messages that I get over Instagram or email, even private conversations, are positive and supportive, and people who either agree with me or they just, respect the conversation and the speaking out. There's a very tiny minority of people who support cancel culture and woke politics at any cost, but they're way overrepresented, in part because of mainstream media, in part because of the algorithms, but also because so many people are afraid to say something.
I think that's right. I think it's, moral cowardice on the part of everyone else. So they become this tiny minority, which I'm willing to bet is about 5% of the population that are true, actual believers, if that. But they are this very vocal and very punitive minority, and they'll call anyone who disagrees a terrible name, a terrible unemployable name. You're racist or anti-trans, or you're ableist or eugenicist or whatever they come up with on that given day. It doesn't need to be fact-based. It doesn't matter, but it has such a chilling effect because nobody wants to be called those things. Nobody wants to be ostracized by their friends or shunned or called these terrible vilifying names. But I wonder what do you say to people that write you and say, well, I support you, but I can't say anything? Because I now encourage people, you don't have to blow your life up like I did. And I literally blew my life up. I mean, I don't live in the place I lived for 30 years. I don't have the same friends. I don't have a job, any job. I don't know that I'll be able to get one doing what I do ever again. But in small ways every day, people can reject the insanity and the nonsense. When as it pertains, I'll give a COVID example with children. There are lots of school districts across the country that still refuse to do parent-teacher conferences in person in school. It's a tiny little thing. If you think that's stupid, say something. Call the school and say, I want my conference in person. I want to meet my child's teacher. Just do that. You don't have to, announce it to the world. But if you don't say anything, they think we all agree. And it just creates this wall of silence. And then you're right. Then the 5%, those voices become the loudest and they're incredibly punitive. But I honestly think you're right. We are the majority, either that see the lies for what they are and don't believe them, or at least support those who question them, even if they don't agree. But it's those who are silent. It was the whole reason I wanted to write the book, was just to say, don't be silent. You have to stand up and say what you think. You have to. It's ridiculous. I mean, I'll give you one other example. In San Francisco, which is where I lived until fairly recently, I was a lone voice. My husband and I were like the only ones. We would do these rallies and like 4 people would come, right, to get the schools open. Of course, the Black Lives Matter rallies were very well attended, but the open schools rallies were not very well attended. And yet, in February of this year, 75% of voters showed up to recall 3 members of the school board for not opening schools. So at the ballot box, when it was anonymous and your friends didn't need to know, they said what they really thought. Yeah. Now just do it publicly.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's usually what I tell people also, is I'm like, you don't need to post something on Facebook. You don't need to write an article. I mean, if you feel comfortable doing those things, then go for it. But you can also, like, it's like, go talk, have a meeting with the principal, go talk to your MP, like your representative, your local representative, like write letters to your representatives and tell them what you think, at least, so that they know that the people that they're representing are dissenting and are not supportive. I mean, votes matter to these people. And if they don't hear these dissenting voices, then they will think that everybody's okay with it and going along. And they need to know that it's not.
Yeah, exactly.
So in your book, Unbuttoned, as you say, you don't just talk about your cancellation, but you talk about your experiences in this industry. I mean, I've never worked in any industry, I guess.
Lucky you.
I'm not really cut out for normal jobs. I did reception for a very long time, so I worked in like office cubicles, and Lord, I did not thrive.
Like that.
But
I can understand that.
Yeah, office culture was really not for me. But I mean, I have an impression of the fashion industry as, oh God, I wouldn't even know I suppose not very healthy, but particularly for women. I wonder if you can talk to me a bit about how you got into that industry and what your experiences were, because I mean, you started really quite young and you did really, really well, of course.
Yeah, I mean, I did. The crazy part is, and maybe this is why it wasn't so hard for me to, well, it was hard, but, to walk away now, is I never wanted to do this. Like, I never wanted to work in corporate America. I really didn't. I saw myself pursuing more creative endeavors. Like I wanted to write books and I wanted to make movies, but I had zero confidence because of the childhood I described.
Mm.
And I didn't, I knew that I didn't deal with sort of uncertainty and insecurity very well. Like when I first graduated from college, I was doing like freelance production on film, but you never knew where your next job was coming from. And it made me just, I couldn't handle that uncertainty. It made me very uneasy. And I knew I needed something a little more stable. And I ended up taking a job at an advertising agency. And I was like, what am I doing? This is not for me. They're all so normal. And I'm not normal like that. But I kind of liked it. I got a regular paycheck, not a very big one. I think my first job was 1994, and my paycheck, I remember my salary was $16,000 a year. So I could not afford much for $16,000 a year in San Francisco, but I got a regular paycheck. It's very young people. I had fun, and like a good little obedient young woman, I liked being good at it, and I got a lot of kudos and praise. And so I just kept going, even though it sort of conflicted in a lot of ways with my values and even what I thought I wanted to do, but I kept going. And at this advertising agency, I worked on all sorts of stuff. I worked on like Taco Bell was my main thing that I worked on. I ended up eating way too much fast food, but I ended up working on Levi's at the end of my 3 years there. And that was really fun and cool. And Levi's is like the anti-fashion brand, in a lot of ways. I mean, Levi's has always been about, one, I'd always worn the brand. So that was cool. So I had like a personal connection to it. I had all my vintage Levi's that I had scoured, vintage stores for during college. And it was like Levi's was about being yourself. Everybody who loves Levi's would say, I wear them my way. Levi's as a brand never dictated to people like, this is the look you have to wear Levi's. They're really for everyone. And I loved that. And so, I worked on Levi's for about 1.5 years at this agency, and then had a few other jobs in between. I ended up going to the Gap for a while in the 90s, which was awful. I hated it more than anything. I've never been so miserable in my whole life. It was like a big sorority. I mean, this is before wokeness took over corporate culture. So it was all about how much you spent on your car and how big your diamond ring was and what push present, which I didn't know what that was, but what push present your husband gave you after you had a baby, which was usually a diamond tennis bracelet. I was unmarried at the time, although I did have a boyfriend, and I worked overtime to try to sort of prove that I was not like these women at this place. Like I just came in with my platinum or over dyed black hair. I would change my hair color every 3 days with my nose ring and just try to prove that I was not like them. The best path was probably to leave, which I did eventually in a big huff. But it was just like this, it was all about conforming to this, what I felt was like a Stepford wife ideal, except if she worked, if that Stepford wife actually went to work. And the whole place was run by women, except at the top where it was, of course, run by men, which is pretty typical in fashion. Women populate all of these fashion companies, but men are left to do the hard work of running them, of course, because, they're logical and sensible.
They're more equipped to be leaders.
Yes, of course. Men run, I think, close to 100% of the top cosmetics brands in the world, which I find
that is so crazy and maddening to me, because obviously it's women who are wearing cosmetics and makeup and
but
these
are there
products.
Women really, Megan? Is there any such thing?
That's a good point. Makeup's for everybody.
That's a whole separate point. So I left the Gap and I ended up at Levi's in 1999. And most people in my age bracket have hopped. It's very unusual. I stayed for 23 years. But I loved the brand itself. And this is the crazy part, is I loved the culture. I just bought into it, and I was able to pursue, as I sort of became more confident as I grew up, I was able to pursue some of these other creative projects. I did write a book while I was there. I made a film while I was there that came out in 2020, a documentary. And so it seemed like the best of both worlds. I was good at it. I was successful. It sort of married the analytical side of my brain with the creative side of my brain. And I really liked it. I mean, it wasn't easy coming up in the 90s and 2000s. The place was rife with subtle and less subtle sexism, as I think probably most fashion companies or companies are. I mean, I tell a story in the book. At this one sales meeting in 2003, I was sort of hiding in my room because I didn't like to go to these sales meetings where all the sales guys were wasted and hitting on the younger female employees. But I heard the next day that there was this incident which came to be known as the naked chicken fight. So you had 3 very senior male employees, all vice presidents, with topless assistants on their shoulders in the pool doing like chicken fights. This happened. God. This happened. No one was fired. This is just what happened. So that was like, it's just a story to indicate kind of what the culture was like. I had 4 children during my time there. In the early days when I first had my children, I think we had 4 or 6 weeks of maternity leave. You had to come back and pump milk in like a sample closet without a door. So, it wasn't exactly fun for women, but I stayed and I kept moving up the ladder. I persisted, and I found that as I moved up, I had more and more influence to kind of help create the sort of culture that I would have preferred to work in. So that was like a benefit of moving up. And that culture was one where women could succeed. I wanted to create a culture where women could succeed on my team, and people from all kinds of backgrounds. And I really believed in this idea that people should be able to be themselves at work. And I apparently was too much myself at work in the end.
I mean, well, hopefully that contributes, and I think that it probably has, or at least will, contributes to changing that kind of culture at the workplace. I mean, I see a lot of backlash happening against cancel culture right now. We're sort of still in the midst of it, but I think we're going to go cycle around personally. But I
think so too.
Yeah.
I hope.
Yeah. I mean, we can talk a bit more about that later, where you see the culture is heading. But I guess I wonder, at what point did your conflict with Levi's begin?
Well, I was outspoken from the very beginning of COVID. March 13th is when the schools closed in San Francisco. And I think I was already talking about the schools cannot close. Like, I saw it coming, and I was sharing and posting about it on social media before they even closed. Nobody noticed for a really long time, or at least nobody said anything. I mean, I didn't have a lot of followers. I started on Facebook, which was terrible idea. I was on Twitter, but not very active. But being on Facebook, you just end up getting in fights with your family, basically. And I was like,
terrible. I don't post anything on my personal Facebook account at all anymore. I use a work Facebook account, but I stopped posting on Facebook, I don't know, a long time ago, because it was like watching people that I know arguing amongst themselves, like somebody, like a friend arguing with a family member, somebody you don't really know very well, an acquaintance arguing with like a good friend of yours, and then just, the onslaught.
Yeah, it was painful. So I leapt off of Facebook a week or two into March, and I moved to what I thought would be greener pastures of Twitter. Obviously, that was naive. But what was interesting on Twitter, and I already had a Twitter account, but I wasn't very active on it, was very quickly you found the folks who were willing to challenge the COVID narrative, because there weren't very many of us from the beginning. Like, we all found community very fast, and you were able to talk to real experts right from the beginning, doctors who now have become, I think, known dissenters and, voices with very large followings. But there were so few of us, we all found each other very quickly.
Can I ask you, I'm so sorry to interrupt you, but can I ask you, you were outspoken from the beginning, from, March 2020. Can I ask you how you knew? Because it took me a little while. I mean, I don't have kids, so the school issue was not something that I caught on to right away. I think probably if I had kids who were in school, I would have been concerned about that, probably maybe earlier on. But I at first I didn't see the big picture, and I thought, okay, so what? We'll lock down for a little while, everybody stop whining. And then I started to talk to different people about their perspectives and read other people's perspectives who were critical and look into it more. I interviewed some people who were critical, and then changed my mind. I realized that something real bad was going on and had to be like, I was wrong. This is terrible. But there were some people like you who saw it right away. Why do you think that was?
Gosh, this is something my husband and I talk about all the time. I don't know. I mean, I was very intent on reading the data from the very beginning, and the data was very clear from the very beginning, and I just kept going down these rabbit holes. I would read the actual data coming out of, well, China you can't count because you don't know what is coming out of China, whether that's true or not. But the data that came out of Italy, if you remember, Italy was the first, right after China, that was the market where the country where we saw all the terrible things happening. The median age of death was 82. We knew this in February and March. And you don't have to be incredibly good at math to know that if the median age of death is 82, that children are not at risk. They're just not. And so I just kept going deeper and deeper into the data. And then I found people like John Ioannidis. I don't know who, are some of the folks you've talked to, but I end up reading these articles in like Stat News, like not a publication that I would normally read, but there were dissenters out there from the very beginning, people like Martin Kulldorff and Jay Bhattacharya, and they were questioning the infection fatality rate. They were questioning lockdowns as effective. They were definitely questioning and challenging the necessity of school closures. There were countries that were doing it differently. Sweden never closed schools for elementary school children. Denmark opened schools only 3 weeks after they shut them because they said the harms are just too great to children. So information was out there. You had to look really, really hard. I think for me, there were sort of two things happening at once. I didn't believe the narrative that we were being fed, and so I sought other information. But I also felt like it was wrong. Even if everything they said was true, it's wrong to tell people they can't leave their homes and they can't see their loved ones and they can't be with sick and dying loved ones. It's just wrong. It's
inhumane. They can't hold a
and
funeral for a family member that's died. Abandon your mother in an old folks home alone.
I mean, if you want to be with I have a close friend who died in August of 2020, not COVID, a young person, 52 years old. We couldn't have a funeral outside at the beach for 20 people. Horrible. It's just wrong. In August of 2020, playgrounds in San Francisco were closed for close to 10 months. Playgrounds. Now, if you live in a city, you don't have a yard. Where were kids supposed to play? It's just... So I could see that it was ineffective. Well, one, I could see that the facts and the data that they were spewing were untrue. Two, these tactics seemed largely ineffective. So we're going to lock down until what? It's like putting your foot on a garden hose. The water will stop and then the water is going to come back out. So what are we doing? I went back and I read the CDC's pre-pandemic playbook from 2006, which said you never close schools for more than a few weeks, even with an infection fatality rate way higher than what we were dealing with COVID. And then there was just the issue that it was wrong. It was a denial of just our basic humanity, our civil rights. Even if all of it was very effective, I would challenge it on the grounds that it's just wrong and cruel.
It's inhumane, and then of course it crossed the boundary of our rights, our constitutional rights, our charter rights.
And then for it to actually be all based on a foundation that is lies, it just is so egregious. And so as I started to criticize and push back on the narrative, what became increasingly alarming was then the silencing of any view that challenged, no matter how diplomatic. I'm very diplomatic. Believe me, you learn to be a diplomatic challenger as a woman in corporate America. Like, you don't get your ideas heard by telling everybody they're an idiot, like, and that you're right. Like, it just doesn't work. You know, you challenge with data and facts, and you say it in a nice way, and you make the men think it was their idea. That's the way it works. That's how it works. And so I had this very, you know, it's interesting, as I was writing my book, I went back and I was like looking at my tweet history, and I'm like, oh my goodness, I'm so nice. I don't even understand what people were mad about, you know? I was always so nice and reasoned. And, you know, my husband is very aggressive. He was not as nice. He got himself kicked off because of it. But I don't know. I just saw it. And I don't know. I ask myself this all the time. Like, I don't know what differentiates a person that sees it. I think there's two things required. There, you have to see the lie, not just COVID, but other lies too. And then you have to actually be willing to buck the narrative and stand up and take the insults and the vilifying and risk friends and job and all that stuff. Those are two different things. And I don't know why, but I just was reading incessantly, and everything that would come out, none of it made sense from the beginning. None of it made sense.
Right. And so you were tweeting away. At what point did the company interfere or try to intervene?
It wasn't actually until September. So I, like, for a full good 6 months was just sitting there tweeting with my like 2,000 followers, and I'm like, maybe they don't notice, maybe no one's on Twitter, I don't know, like I'll just keep going until someone says something. And then I got a call. I got that fateful call, and we were all working virtually, of course. We weren't in the office, and none of us just called each other, right? You had meetings on Zoom. And so as soon as the phone rang, I was like, oh, this is the call. I knew it was the call.
Why am I getting a phone call?
Yeah, who calls anyone anymore? And it was from the head of corporate communications, which in like regular person speak means, you know, her job was to manage the reputation of the company. So through PR for the company versus the brand, the Levi's brand, which I owned PR for the brand. She said, people are noticing your Twitter. I said, okay, good. And she said, you know, you should remember that when you speak on behalf of the company. And I said, but I don't. I'm a mom. I'm a public school mom. I speak on behalf of myself. And it doesn't say Levi's chief marketing officer in my profile or anything. And she hemmed and hawed a bit. And I said, are you asking me to stop? And she said, no, I can't do that. And I said, okay, bye. That was kind of the conversation. And in my naivete, I thought, well, maybe that'll be it. You know, I held my ground. But then it was just like every 2 weeks, somebody else would call me, you know, the head of HR, the head of legal, a board member. It was just constant every 2 weeks. But in September, later that same month, when I got the first call, the private schools opened in San Francisco. So I thought, and all my peers sent their kids to private school. I was the only one that sends my kids. I am the only one that sends my kids to public school. But I thought, okay, now this hypocrisy will be too great. Like, now they'll be okay with it. They'll surely be okay with me advocating for poor children having what their kids have access to. They just were marching for BLM and all this stuff. Like, now they're going to say it's okay. Oh no. I was sorely mistaken, because it never mattered. You know, they never cared about social justice. They care about, you know, getting what's right for them and adopting this pose of wokeness, for lack of a better word, so that people like them. And so, you know, even after the private schools opened and all their kids went back to school, they continued to call me and tell me, you can't say these things. You just can't say these things. You represent the company when you speak. But here's the other weird part is I got promoted that year. So for all the, you know, you can't say this, stop doing this. You're a Trumper. I got that a lot too.
Mhm.
I still got promoted because the business was good, and I was doing a good job in my role. But ultimately, a year and a half after I got promoted, they got sick of it, and it really did. I built a larger following. I think, I don't even know, maybe 30,000 people, not that many still, but I definitely had some high profile trolls. And employees were really angry, and employees were complaining to HR, and they were calling, they were writing to the CEO. And externally, there were people calling our ethics hotline and saying I was like a walking, talking ethics violation.
Mhm.
And I think, although it was a very small number of actual people, it was a lot of noise. And I think they just got tired of it.
Is it that they didn't want to deal with the controversy? Did they ever tell you why you can't say they're saying you can't say these things? Did they say you can't say these things because
Not really. It's upsetting people.
yeah.
I mean, they said some worse things privately too. I mean, I had written a proposal, um, because Levi's is a company that has taken public stands on all sorts of causes,
Mhm. It's
So
not an apolitical company.
it is not, well, they would say they're apolitical, but they would call themselves a values-led company.
Okay.
Now, all the stances that they take are aligned with one particular party and direction, but they would say it's apolitical. But at one point, and it was after the private schools had opened, and there had been a couple of articles in left-leaning publications. So there was for those of us who were anti-lockdowners and open schoolers, there's like these seminal moments over the course of the couple of years. And there was this piece by journalist Alec McGillis in the New Yorker in, I think, October of 2020. And it detailed the life of a young child in Baltimore, poor kid, mom's a drug addict, and how impossible basically this situation was for him, and how he was, through Zoom school, being denied any opportunity for an equal education and any sort of development, social, educational, etc. And that, I mean, he didn't say it this way, but that this idea of public schools being closed while private being open was a structurally racist and classist policy. I don't think he used those words, but that's what I would, that's how I framed it. And so I thought, okay, it's in the New Yorker. Now the lefties are going to see. But of course, that's not what happened, because it was just a religion at this point, that if you had to believe that staying home, isolating yourself, was the only way to be a good person, and anyone who challenged that was a heretic and needed to be
And didn't care
banished.
about others. I mean, the
And
ironic
that's
thing
right.
about those arguments is that they would call people like you and I, people who are challenging the lockdowns, and saying kids should be back in school and people should be allowed to be around other people. This is a really important part of life, and obviously people suffered immensely from job loss and businesses shutting down and all sorts of other things, but that it was just
They were
enormously
evil.
cruel in so many ways. I mean, the overdose rates skyrocketed.
Yeah.
People couldn't get the health treatment, mental health or physical health treatments that they
Yeah.
needed. And yeah, we were
The
accused
evil
of
one.
not caring about other people.
Yeah, exactly. But the response, what I was going to say is the response to my proposal that we should weigh in. And when I say weigh in, I meant like we could pen an op-ed in the local newspaper, and we could make it about our employees not being able to work, and the children of our employees not being able to attend school. And this was harmful. As a leader in the business community, we punched above our weight class. Why not weigh in here? They said, we can't do it because our kids, our executives have kids in private school. So they said the quiet part out loud. It will make us look bad.
Can I, why were the private schools open and the public schools closed? And how was this being defended by anyone?
They conveniently didn't defend it. They just didn't, they pretended it wasn't happening. But the reason, because the private schools can do what they want. And, in a sense, I guess capitalism speaks, because if they weren't open, the parents would pull their kids and pull their money, right? The public schools, it depends on what city you live in, who decides whether they open or not, whether it's the mayor or whether the governor. In Florida, the governor said the schools are opening, and the teachers union sued him there. He pushed back and he won, and all the schools opened in Florida in August of 2020. In San Francisco, it's the Board of Education, and they were working in tandem with the teachers unions, which they should not be doing. The teachers unions are supposed to represent the teachers. The Board of Ed is supposed to represent the kids and families of San Francisco. But the Board of Ed did the teachers unions bidding, and public health gave the Board of Ed and teachers unions cover. They said it wasn't safe to open schools. Public health did not make the decision themselves, but they set such onerous requirements and restrictions that they made it impossible to open the schools. In San Francisco, the mayor actually sued the school district to open the schools unsuccessfully.
Mm-hmm. And were you getting flack from in your personal life? How did your speaking out about this impact you beyond the workplace conflict?
Yeah, it was bad. It was either silence and distancing. I became quite toxic. People just sort of, I just don't hear from my friends from before times. There were no falling outs. I just don't really ever hear from them. Every once in a while, I get a message that'll be like, I don't hate you, but I think you're really confounding. Thanks.
I don't hate you. I love, they're so condescending, because it doesn't occur to them that maybe you don't like them either. You know what I mean? Like, they think the whole dislike is one-sided. Like,
one way.
I don't hate you, but I just don't think we can have a relationship like we used to. And I'm like, why are you assuming I want to have a relationship
You're
with
so right.
you?
I like that. That's such a good point.
I mean, maybe that's sort of egotistical, but it's also like, I've had this experience so many times with so many people, and I'm like, do you think that I respect you after you took a position that said that you think that men can become women, or that you're advocating for people to wear masks for the rest of their lives? Yeah. Do you think that makes me really respect you as an intelligent person?
I wish that had been my retort. Now you're giving me fodder. Mostly, I just don't hear from them, and it's hard. I have friends. I had a cohort of friends that were like my girls from college, and I just don't hear. Yeah. The worst part is family. It's my brother and I haven't spoken in, I guess it's almost 2 years now, and he publicly trolled me and tagged my company, and it was brutal. It is brutal. The last interaction, which was only via social media, he had said, like, I don't want us to interact on social media. It's toxic. So I was like, fine, I won't. I'm not going to look at anything you write. I'm not going to follow you or respond to you. I didn't think that meant I should not participate in social media, because the fact is, for me, and everybody can mock Twitter all they want, this is how I found a community of like-minded parents who were willing to stand up and fight with me for this. And I do believe we honestly made a difference. Playgrounds in San Francisco would not have opened after 10 months without parents banding together and pushing back. And so I was not about to abandon this community that I'd found. And these people are now my friends, my only friends. But he kept trolling me. And he, even after my story broke and I, quit my job, and there was a lot of, I would say most of the coverage was neutral to positive. It leaned toward positive. There were only a handful of pieces that were just like blatantly negative. And my brother did not like that. So he reached out to a reporter at the New York Times on Twitter to say publicly, this is not the real story.
That's a real betrayal.
Yeah.
That's harsh.
It was devastating. Yeah. So that's the one that hurts. My friends, the friends hurt too. I don't know. All of it hurts. My life is unrecognizable, honestly, from 2 years ago. Like, I don't have the city that I loved, which I don't love anymore, but that's fine. I don't have a job. I had hundreds, if not thousands of friends at Levi's, or friends. I thought they were friends,
Yeah.
but think about it. I'm there 23 years, like people across decades and, retired employees, current employees. I have no contact with anyone. And then I had my actual friends who find me confounding, and then family who rejects me. The good news is I have an awesome husband, though. So
Yeah, that helps a lot. I mean, you need somebody supportive in your life when you're dealing with that kind of thing. And I mean, and you I'm sure could say this as well. I always tell people that it'll be okay. Like it will be hard for a while, and you will lose friends, and you might lose family, you might lose a job, you'll lose political circles, social circles, and it'll be hard, but then it'll be okay because you do make new friends, you make new
you
connections,
do.
and you honestly become a more resilient person, which is beneficial.
I think all that's true. All of that is true. It's hard. I definitely have my moments where I'm like, what have I done? But I just there was no other way for me. Like I couldn't. Here was the most insane part at work is there actually was one person, the head of human resources, who would say to me behind the scenes, I agree with you, but you can't say it. I
Mhm.
agree with everything you're saying, but you can't say these things. I'm sorry. No. You're telling me that I cannot call a thing true, like I can't call a lie, and I have to accept the harms being done, not just to children, but people from all walks of life, small business owners, people with dying loved ones. I have to just allow that to happen because people won't like me if I call that a lie. Sorry, we're not doing that. I'm not doing that. You're a coward.
So
Not
how
you.
did it I didn't take that personally. Um how did it come to blows? What happened to get you to the point that you left Levi's?
Yeah. So in the summer of 2021, I had dinner with my boss, the CEO, and he said you could actually be the CEO. And I was in the job that would potentially become CEO. So it didn't seem that crazy. He said, but you've got to stop with the social media. And I said, honestly, his name's Chip. I don't I appreciate what you're saying, but at this point, even if I stop, it doesn't matter because I've been doing this for a year and a half. So you either think I can do the job or you don't. And I'm not going to stop because the kids still don't have their freedom back.
Because it's important.
It's too important. And I stood up for kids in sports, and I really see this as an extension of that. And kids are the most vulnerable and voiceless, and they rely on us and they need us as adults to stand up for them and make sure that they aren't being abused, and that they aren't suffering from these cruel policies. So, it remains unclear, like if he held out the job as sort of a, you know, like he was as just sort of a bait to try to get me to stop. But I do believe he really thought I could do the job and wanted me to have the job, but I wasn't going to stop, so that wasn't going to happen. But at a certain point in the fall of 21, he said, okay, you're a real candidate, I need to do a background check on you, which may or may not be standard policy. And then he threw in there, I need to do it on your husband too, which to me set off some alarm bells and seemed kind of weird.
Mhm.
But I agreed. I didn't really have a choice because it was either that or he was going to tell me I was probably canned right away. So I agreed. And it took months passed, and he did not come back to me on the background check. And I knew that it had come in. I knew it had been done in 2 weeks in my mind, and that he just didn't want to tell me. And it was finally in January of 22 where he said the background check came back. There's no place for you in the company anymore because of your outspokenness on social media on these things. He asked me to stay until they found my replacement. They offered me a lot of money, which would come with a non-disclosure agreement on the terms of the departure. I did not want to sign a non-disclosure agreement, so I quit about a month later and then announced that resignation very publicly on Barry Weiss's Common Sense Substack. So that's how it all went down.
Mhm. And there was a point when you were asked to go on an apology tour.
Yeah.
But that was supposedly connected to like accusations of, it sounds like, racism.
Racism.
What was it that happened there?
Yeah, so I was the sponsor for the Black Employee Resource Group. Employee resource groups are like a new trendy thing in corporate America where you have these like affinity groups. They're not all race based. I mean, there was a parents employee resource group, there was a veterans, but I was asked to be the executive sponsor for the Black Employee Resource Group. Apparently, I was friends with everyone in it. But apparently my stance around schools, it was billed as a racist stance because it meant that I did not care if Black children died. That was the way it was taken. But here's the other part is all the sort of cries of racism really accelerated because in March of 2021, I went on Fox News. Me and my open schools moms had been trying to
Which
get
proves that you're a
racist.
racist.
Exactly. So we had been trying to get our voices heard in more mainstream channels, although it is mainstream. It's the most popular cable news network, but you know what I mean when I say mainstream. And when I moved my family from California to Denver, I had a tweet that went a little crazy, and Laura Ingram's show reached out to me to go on the show, and I agreed. And I knew it would be fraught, but I also trusted myself to say what I meant and not be, caught in any traps that she might set for me. And so I did the show anyway. And so after that, that's when the kind of screams that I was a terrible racist came to the fore. And I was asked to do an apology tour for the Black Employee Resource Group, which I was the sponsor of. I agreed. I did it in June. I only agreed because I knew that I was not going to apologize. I was just going to explain myself. I refused to apologize because I didn't do anything wrong. I was asked 3 questions. One was, do you see why what you're doing is racist? And I said, it's not, basically. The second was about my husband, who they said, he's an anti-vaxxer. Defend your husband. And I said, I don't have to. He doesn't work here. He can say whatever he wants. He can do whatever he wants. Are you an anti-vaxxer? I'm like, whatever. And then the last was a very nice comment, which was just, thank you for being so open and honest. If I had children, I would probably do the same. And people acknowledged, you said nothing. We agree with everything you said, or we have no issue with anything you said on the Ingram show. But the fact that you said it to her makes you a wolf in sheep's clothing.
Why do you think that it is that all of these issues are conflated? Why is it that, for example, all people who consider themselves leftist or progressives, or they would consider themselves liberals, I suppose, although they're not liberal, there's a stack of issues that you have to care about and speak about in a certain way. So there's COVID, you support the lockdowns, you support the mandates. There's, anti-racism, which is, what they would consider it, although that's contested by many. There's the gender identity issue. It's like you're handed a packet.
Yeah,
it's
I
like
would
you have to.
I would even put body positivity in there.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah.
It's in the same sort of zone. I mentioned that one because I got in a lot of trouble as a fat phobe. Also, because if I cited any studies that showed that obesity was a high risk factor for poor COVID outcomes. And I was so careful. All I would do is like literally pull a quote from the medical study. I wouldn't even make any comment on it. But that meant I was ableist and fat phobic and didn't care if fat people died.
Yeah, well, COVID doesn't care if fat people die either. I know it sounds rude, but you know what I mean? Like, it's like, that was a reality, that things like obesity and diabetes would have a major impact in terms of how well you managed COVID.
You can't say it. And that's my issue with all of this is we are all these, if we're complicit in these lies, people are harmed.
Yeah.
Children are harmed from this gender ideology. people are harmed with the body positivity movement. Yes, you should not, your value is not derived from how you look. Look, I've been anorexic, I've been overweight. I am not less of a person because I am skinny or overweight or any of it. But that doesn't mean that being morbidly obese is not a severe risk to my health. It is. And we need to be able to say that and help folks live a healthier lifestyle. But we are more afraid of offending people than actually helping people live healthier lives. It's such a good question. Why do you think they're all connected?
I don't know. I mean, I think it just seems like people are handed a set of beliefs and takes and positions, and that they, in order to remain in the in group, which they believe is the good and not bad group, they have to repeat these particular mantras and have this, certain position on all of these issues. And because what happens if you question any of these things, including narratives around climate change as well,
Yeah.
you are you're you're labeled as a right winger, which according to them is a horrible thing. You're labeled as a racist, you're labeled as a transphobe, you're labeled as not caring about other people. You're essentially labeled as a bad person, and it means that your views and opinions and voice doesn't matter. And then they use it to convince other people to not listen to you or take you seriously or engage with what you're saying. You're like, don't actually listen to what she's arguing around how lockdowns impact kids.
Right.
She's a Trumper, she's an anti-vaxxer, she's a right winger. So you just it's bullying and it's culty. Like, don't speak to them, they're dead too, they don't exist anymore.
Yeah, I agree. All of that. I think, most of the issues, I think that the thing that I'm still trying to work out is most of the issues you've cited, whether it's sort of like a race-based ideology or gender or, body positivity, like these all came from the furthest reaches of the left. And it's, for lack of a better word, the woke ideology. I mean, I would even somehow, I might even put anti-Israel sentiment in that bucket. I think in all the sort of discussion about anti-Semitism, I say this, I'm Jewish right now, and the anti-Semitism on the right, I see so much on the left, and nobody wants to really deal with that either. The difference with COVID is it didn't generate there. It generated from the party. Yeah. So usually the direction is it comes from these sort of like woke activists, and then the party adopts it as part of their platform. With COVID, it came from the Democratic Party and got adopted as the woke view, that you had to, stay home forever and wear a mask and get 1,000 vaccines forever and anon. So the direction was a little different. And I thought that meant, well, I naively thought this is a campaign strategy to get Trump out of office. And once that happens, it'll be done and we can go back to normal. And boy, was I wrong. My husband kept telling me I was wrong, that it would not end. And I think at that point, it was just there was such a fervor. It was like religious. It was culty. Even if they wanted to dial it back, they couldn't have dialed it back, meaning the party and public health leaders.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I mean, the one of the interesting things about COVID is that, and actually this does connect to a lot of these other issues too. I mean, you talk about woke capitalism in your book, and it seems like a major blind spot, or they don't want to acknowledge it or admit it in any case, that these purported leftists, the left has generally been associated with anti-capitalism and with socialism. What they're doing is they're supporting a corporate agenda, especially with the COVID thing, but all these other issues, it's connected because, of course, these corporations are taking these activist issues and using it to bolster money. Their brand.
Yeah, they do it. I mean, I don't think this is too cynical of a view. They take these stances. They're basically capitalizing on Gen Z and millennial social activism. I think simultaneously, it's not the 80s anymore when greed was good. Now these very rich people feel very guilty about being very white and very privileged and very wealthy. Now they still want to be those things. Make no mistake. You don't stumble upon $1 billion by accident. That doesn't just happen if it's not your life's goal, believe me. But because they feel guilty about it, they wrap themselves in this, I'm an altruist, I care about all of this stuff, to kind of distance themselves from the greed and to kind of cordon themselves off from it so that people like them. Sam Bankman-Fried is sort of the best example of that right now. And he said it. He said the quiet part out loud. He says it's just this thing we woke Westerners do so people like us. And in doing it, these folks avoid scrutiny for a really, really long time. Elizabeth Holmes did it. Scott Bankman-Fried did it. And there's just this unholy alliance between government, corporations, and the press is complicit as well. And they're all working in tandem to support these, whatever cause of the moment is. And if you go against it, you're a heretic and you need to be banished. But I agree with you. It's so upside down to me because I thought the left, but all of it, I thought the left was supposed to be anti-capitalism. Mm-hmm. And yet they supported lockdowns, which was the largest transfer of upward wealth in the history of the world. I don't understand.
Exactly. And most punitive of poor and working class people. And, in support of big pharma and big tech and big government and mainstream media.
All of it. And even the issue with big pharma, one of the other things I did get in trouble, I mostly kept my tweeting to kids in schools, but every once in a while I'd veer a little bit. And I talked about, pharma and the profit motive driving, pharma's agenda, which is true for any company. Their agenda is always about revenue and profit. By definition, that's their fiduciary responsibility. And this was on the heels of, everything being exposed in the opioid crisis with Purdue Pharma and Pfizer and J&J. And yet I was chastised for stating what I thought was utterly obvious. It's in the bylaws of any company that the mission is around profit. That's what you have to do. You owe the shareholders a return. But I was told pharma CEOs are the most values-led CEOs there are, and they only care about us. It's like, amazing. Do we live in China?
What a crazy thing to say, considering all that we know. Yeah, especially in light of the opioid crisis and what happened with OxyContin.
Yep.
So you published this letter on Barry Weiss's Substack. What happened then?
Well, I'd already resigned. I resigned the day before. I don't think anyone expected me to do it because in their minds, no one gives up money. So I think that it was just sort of utterly astonishing to them that I would give up the money so that I could keep talking.
Sorry, I shouldn't say letter, article.
Yeah, whatever. It was a letter. It was an op-ed or whatever it was. There was a lot of attention on the story, and it was pretty broad. It wasn't just right-wing media. It was pretty broad. It was in the New York Times, and I was on CNN, but of course Fox loves it because I'm this sort of former lefty who's criticizing the left, and not just COVID policy, but the illiberalism and censorship of the left. So that was a crazy month of lots of press. And then I decided I would write a book, which is, what I did in sort of a fever state over the course of the summer. And now I'm just talking about the book. And Levi's, of course, has issued all these nonsensical statements in response to the story I have told, which is true. And I have the emails and the text messages and receipts to back it up, and they're all in the book. But they're saying they always supported my open schools advocacy. That's a lie. And they're saying that they took issue with it when I criticized public health officials because I put employees' lives in danger. Well, first of all, criticizing closed schools is criticizing public health officials because they kept the schools closed. So that's a ridiculous thing to say. And so what? I'm not allowed to criticize public health. Public health closed playgrounds. Public health took basketball hoops down. I'm not allowed to criticize public health. It doesn't even make any sense. And of course, the private communication that I include in the book reveals otherwise. That had nothing to do with it. They just, I was a risk to their shiny social justice image. And for some reason, closures till no COVID was the socially just stance, which doesn't make any sense for all the reasons you point out.
It makes no sense. It's totally confounding. So what's next for you? Do you have a grand plan?
No. I have no grand plan. I mean, I'm passionate about this particular issue with children. I do want there to be some accountability. I think it could be a very long time before there is any. But I'm equally committed to just continuing to speak out on the illiberalism of the left. I mean, I know it's on the right as well, but I think it is more pronounced right now on the left. And I hope that if I keep saying, I mean, it's almost like my canned line at this point, but the only thing that protects our free speech is more free speech. And so I'm just going to keep talking, and hopefully others will do the same. I am also making a documentary film right now about the harms to the kids from the prolonged school closures. And it's really devastating, to hear from these children directly as to what they're going through. So no, I'm just, it's been less than a year. I'm trying to, and I wrote a book in that time and have filmed probably the better part of a documentary. So I'll figure it out. I don't know exactly what's next, but.
That's very impressive. It's very hard to write a book. I've never made a documentary, but I know that it's hard. And I'm impressed that you've managed to do all that within just a year. Do you have any idea when the documentary might be coming out?
I think it won't be till the end of next year. Take some time.
Okay.
And I'm hoping we find a big mainstream distributor because I want everyone to see it.
Yeah, I hope so too. And Unbuttoned, I'm presuming, can be found everywhere that books are found.
It can be found everywhere online that books are found. So Amazon, Barnes and Noble. If a lot of folks like to buy direct from the publisher, so that would be levisunbuttoned.com. Okay. And the audiobook will be out this week. People are asking me that. So.
And I do have one final very important question for you, which is, do you think that low-rise jeans are going to replace high-waisted jeans? I have really, really, really big concerns and fears around this because that was the worst pants trend ever to have happened. And it happened to me because I was in high school. I graduated from high school in 1997, and that was, it was so long before I could get pants that would come all the way up to my belly button like I want them
to. Okay, you're 10 years younger than me. So I had the low rise trend when I could sort of deal with it then. I was young enough, I was in my 20s. It is back. It is back. But here's the good news. In jeans, I find that when a style comes back or emerges, it just sort of everything is okay now. It's still okay to wear skinny jeans, even though they're not actually the sort of most on trend jean. A looser jean is more on trend right now, but you still look good. Some people just prefer and will always wear their skinny jeans. I myself wear a 501 all the time, which is a classic straight. I also prefer a high rise, and at 53 will not be returning to the low rise. But I think you're fine. I think you're okay with mom jeans and high rise jeans, and even maybe you'll go a little lower to a mid rise.
I won't.
No. Okay, don't do it. I don't think you have to. I think I think the variety of styles is what's in now.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I like the mom jeans. I really, really like the skinny jean. And this is just a body type issue. I've never had the body that a woman is supposed to have according to the fashion industry, which is well, it seems to be that women are supposed to be small on top and then have a thin waist and then have a huge butt. And I'm more my top is always bigger than it's supposed to be. And then my bottom is smaller than it's supposed to be. And this is not because I'm extremely thin. It's just that I've never really had the hips that I'm supposed to. So if I wear low rise jeans, they just don't stay on. And I just have to spend my life pulling up my pants. And it's very irritating. But it's also unflattering because my love handles, which
I think, well, that's the problem with the low rises, the love handles and
and
the,
even when
I
I
have,
was very, very thin at 17, I somehow still had love handles. It's just the way
it's
my
just the way it
body
is. I actually love it now. Is that I think there's a range of styles and they're all fine. And some women wear them all. You know, literally, will switch back and forth between a high rise skinny and a loose or a boot cut. Boot cut is also back.
I
I don't know
like
how you
it. I
feel about.
like that boot cut is back. I've always been a
Yeah,
fan. Yeah. But
yeah,
high
me too.
rise boot cut.
I think everything goes now.
Yeah, I'm so into the boot cut. I was pretty excited about that.
Yeah, that's a good one.
Anyway, the most important issues, now that we finally were able to address that, I can end the interview.
Soon I'll know nothing about fashion. I've been trying to distance myself and not pay attention to it. So you caught me at the tail end of my denim knowledge, because when I was still there is when we were starting to develop the low rise and the boot, because it takes a year for them to come out. So pretty soon I'll know nothing, and you should just not ask me about what's in style.
Okay. I mean, I'm not like a super fashion person either, but I try to not get like so far out of the loop that it's embarrassing. Thank you so much for talking with me today.
Yeah.
I really enjoyed the conversation, and I'm really, really glad that we were able to connect.
Me too. Thank you
Okay.
so much.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye bye.